The slap of a closing door echoed down the marble corridors of Central Trust Bank that day, louder than any announcement on the busy street outside. In a moment that would forever alter the course of events, an elderly black woman named Mabel Johnson was forcefully escorted out of the bank by a stern-faced manager. The manager, Mr. Ronald Pierce, whose scowl and rigid manner had become notorious throughout the branch, had barked orders that left no room for explanation. "You do not belong here," he had declared, his voice booming over the hushed murmurs of shocked customers. Mabel, with her gentle eyes and dignified presence, had stood silently as Mr. Pierce made her the target of his baseless anger. The sight of her, with her neatly tied gray hair and a simple floral dress, contrasted sharply with the harshness of his words and actions. Customers watched in disbelief as she was forced to leave, her hand clutching a worn leather purse that had seen better days. The atmosphere in the bank shifted immediately. Conversation died, and all eyes turned toward the unfolding drama. Yet, as the door closed behind Mabel and the murmurs of outrage began to swell, an information gap was formed that left everyone wondering why a respected bank manager would treat an elderly customer in such a callous manner. What had Mabel done to provoke such cruelty? And why did Mr. Pierce, who prided himself on upholding the bank's values, behave with such unchecked prejudice? In that charged moment, the seeds of a dramatic reversal were sown. Unbeknownst to Mr. Pierce, the elderly woman he had so rudely expelled carried a secret that would upend his entire world. Mabel Johnson was not merely a longtime customer with modest means. She was a formidable force whose past, hidden behind the gentle smile and quiet demeanor, held power that even Mr. Pierce could not imagine. The incident in that busy bank had set the stage for a twist that promised to challenge the very notions of authority and respect. The silent questions in every onlooker's mind grew louder. What was Mabel truly capable of? How could an act of such blatant disrespect lead to a stunning revelation that would shock everyone present? The tension in the air was palpable, and it was clear that the events of that day were about to take an unexpected turn that would force everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about power, identity, and justice. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and comment below where you are watching from. For our returning subscribers, thank you so much for your unwavering support. It truly means a lot to our community. Central Trust Bank stood as a proud symbol of stability and tradition in the heart of the city. Its grand entrance, polished marble floors, and ornate columns exuded an air of authority and dependability. The bank had long been a fixture in the community, serving people from every walk of life, and its reputation for excellence was well known. Yet, within its stately walls, there were tensions that simmered beneath the surface, tensions that reflected the broader struggles of a society in transition. Mr. Ronald Pierce, the bank manager, was a man in his late 50s who had spent most of his career in the financial industry. He was known for his strict adherence to rules and his belief that maintaining order was paramount. Pierce carried himself with a stern dignity and expected nothing less than perfection from his staff and customers alike. Over the years, his rigid views had hardened, and he had developed a reputation for intolerance towards those who did not conform to his narrow idea of propriety. His uniform, always immaculate and adorned with numerous commendations, was a constant reminder of the power he wielded within the bank's corridors. In stark contrast was Mabel Johnson, an elderly black woman in her early 70s whose life story was woven with resilience and quiet strength. Mabel had been a loyal customer of Central Trust Bank for decades. Despite facing numerous hardships in her life, she had always carried herself with grace and dignity. With silver hair neatly tied back and eyes that had witnessed both sorrow and joy, Mabel was the embodiment of perseverance. Her modest attire, a simple floral dress paired with a well-worn cardigan, spoke of a life lived with humility and hard-earned wisdom. Mabel had always been known for her calm and gentle nature, traits that endeared her to many in the community. She had quietly built a reputation for fairness and was respected by those who knew her story. What no one knew was that Mabel's past held secrets that would eventually challenge the very foundations of the bank and its leadership. Her unassuming presence concealed a history of savvy investments and an uncanny ability to navigate complex financial landscapes, skills that had quietly placed her in a position of power unbeknownst to even the bank's top executives. The setting of Central Trust Bank, with its blend of opulence and historical gravitas, provided the perfect backdrop for the impending drama. Inside, the bank bustled with activity, tellers efficiently serving customers, managers reviewing reports in quiet offices, and security personnel diligently patrolling the corridors. Outside, the city's diversity was on full display, with people from various backgrounds coming together in a place that was supposed to represent unity and stability. On that fateful day, the incident that unfolded was not merely a personal dispute between a bank manager and a longtime customer. It was a microcosm of larger societal issues. The clash between Mr. Pierce's outdated, biased views and Mabel Johnson's quiet, unyielding dignity highlighted the growing gap between traditional authority and the evolving demands for equality and respect. As the event progressed, it became clear that this was not an isolated act of cruelty, but a spark that would ignite a dramatic transformation within the bank, and potentially the community at large. In the corridors of Central Trust Bank, as the polished surfaces reflected the tension of the moment, every individual present sensed that something significant was about to occur. The very fabric of what the bank represented was being challenged, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone to reevaluate their notions of power, respect, and justice. In the aftermath of the shocking expulsion, the atmosphere within Central Trust Bank turned electric with murmurs and disbelief. Mr. Pierce stood at the center of the turmoil, his face a mask of controlled anger as he attempted to justify his actions. "I have always maintained the standards of this bank," he declared loudly to anyone who would listen. "Rules are in place for a reason, and when they are broken, I must act decisively." His voice, though confident, carried a note of desperation that hinted at deeper insecurities. As news of the incident spread throughout the branch, whispers filled the air. Colleagues, many of whom had quietly observed Mr. Pierce's harsh treatment of Mabel Johnson, exchanged disapproving glances. A teller in the lobby murmured, "He has done this before, targeting those he does not like." Another staff member recalled a similar incident with another customer, suggesting that Mr. Pierce's actions were not isolated but part of a troubling pattern of behavior driven by personal bias. Meanwhile, Mabel Johnson, who had been escorted out of the bank in a manner that was both demeaning and violent, maintained her composure. Though her eyes welled with tears from the pain of the slap, she carried herself with the grace that had defined her entire life. In the moments following her removal, she quietly made her way to a nearby bench outside the bank. Passers-by looked on with a mix of sympathy and indignation, and soon, the incident began to take on a life of its own. Videos captured on smartphones emerged, spreading rapidly on social media under hashtags like #RespectMabel and #JusticeForMabel. Within the bank, the conflict grew more complex as a union representative and a legal advisor arrived to assess the situation. They began collecting statements from staff and customers, many of whom had witnessed the incident firsthand. The internal review process was set in motion, and preliminary findings suggested that Mr. Pierce had a history of similar behavior. Instances where his actions were later described as unnecessarily harsh and influenced by racial prejudice. As the investigation unfolded, additional details came to light that cast further doubt on Mr. Pierce's conduct. A set of internal records revealed that several complaints had been lodged against him over the years, but none had been thoroughly investigated. This revelation added fuel to the fire, as staff members and customers alike began to question how someone with such a record could continue to wield authority within a bank that prided itself on fairness and community service. At the same time, a respected community member who had long been an advocate for civil rights stepped forward to speak out. In an impassioned statement to local news outlets, the advocate declared, "This is not merely about a bank manager acting out of anger. is about a system that allows prejudice to flourish unchecked. We must hold our institutions accountable for every act of injustice. This statement resonated with many, and soon, local activists began organizing peaceful demonstrations outside the bank. Within the bank, tension continued to build as Mr. Pierce held a meeting with his senior staff, attempting to downplay the incident. His explanations were met with skeptical looks and hushed whispers. Some staff members dared to ask, "Is this how we treat our most loyal customers?" Their voices, though low, carried a message of discontent that could not be ignored. The conflict buildup reached a critical point when Mabel Johnson's attorney formally requested that the bank produce all internal records related to Mr. Pierce's past conduct. This request, though procedural, was seen as a direct challenge to the manager's authority. As the records were reviewed, the evidence of previous incidents began to surface, and it became apparent that Mr. Pierce's behavior was part of a disturbing pattern. By the end of the conflict buildup, the atmosphere in Central Trust Bank was fraught with tension. What had started as an act of blatant racism had evolved into a major controversy, one that threatened the very reputation of the bank. Staff, customers, and a wider community all sensed that this incident was merely the spark that would ignite a larger movement for justice and reform. The stage was now set for a dramatic escalation, as the truth behind Mr. Pierce's actions was poised to challenge the established order and force the institution to reckon with its past. As the internal review process gathered momentum, the tension within Central Trust Bank escalated dramatically. News of the incident had spread beyond the bank's walls, and social media was ablaze with outcry. Hashtags such as hashtag Justice for Mabel and hashtag End Racism in Banks trended locally, and local news channels began broadcasting footage of the incident. The public demanded answers, and it was clear that this issue could no longer be swept under the rug. Within the bank, the internal affairs team, led by a new overseer, Inspector David Ramirez, started compiling all available evidence. Digital records, witness statements, and archive complaints against Mr. Pierce painted a troubling picture. Inspector Ramirez, known for his impartiality and commitment to reform, addressed the staff in a closed meeting. "We cannot allow bias to dictate our actions. The evidence is clear, and we must take this opportunity to correct our course." His words resonated with many younger officers who had long been uneasy about the culture that had allowed such behavior to continue. At the same time, the community outside the bank rallied in support of Mabel Johnson. A local civil rights group organized a peaceful protest in front of the bank, with people holding signs that read "Respect for all" and "Our community deserves better." The protest drew media attention and added further pressure on the bank's leadership to act decisively. As residents gathered and voices rose in unison, it became evident that the incident had struck a chord with the public, and the demand for accountability grew louder with each passing hour. Inside the bank, tensions reached new heights as Mr. Pierce attempted to defend his actions in a meeting with senior management. His tone was defensive, and his explanations were met with incredulity. One board member, speaking on behalf of a coalition of concerned employees, said, "We are not merely discussing one incident. We are addressing a pattern of behavior that undermines the values of our institution." This statement underscored the seriousness of the matter and indicated that many within the bank were now aligning themselves with the call for reform. The escalating crisis forced the bank's higher management to intervene. An emergency meeting was convened with the board of directors, and a decision was made to temporarily suspend Mr. Pierce pending a full investigation. The announcement was a turning point, and while some loyalists of Mr. Pierce protested quietly, the majority of the staff appeared relieved. This decisive action sent a clear message. The bank would no longer tolerate behavior driven by prejudice. As Inspector Ramirez continued his investigation, additional evidence emerged that further discredited Mr. Pierce's actions. Security footage from within the bank showed that Mabel Johnson had always conducted herself with dignity and had followed all protocols, contradicting the manager's baseless claims. The footage, combined with internal memos revealing prior complaints against Mr. Pierce, reinforced the narrative that his actions were not only unprofessional, but also rooted in racism. Public pressure, too, was mounting. Social media posts and local news segments repeatedly called for justice and reform, and civil rights activists joined forces with community leaders to demand accountability from the bank. In one televised interview, a well-known community activist stated, "This incident is not just about one man's actions. It is about a system that has long allowed bias to thrive. Today, we stand together to demand change." As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the bank was on the brink of a major overhaul. Internal discussions turned into public statements, and the board of directors vowed to implement sweeping reforms aimed at ensuring that every employee, regardless of rank, would be held to the highest standard of conduct. The tension, once a simmering undercurrent, had now reached a boiling point, a moment when the entire institution was forced to confront its past and chart a new course for the future. Every new piece of evidence and every public demonstration added to the rising tension. The atmosphere within the bank was charged with urgency, and every individual present could sense that the outcome of this investigation would have far-reaching consequences. It was no longer just a matter of one officer's misconduct. It was a call for systemic change. The community's voice had grown too strong to be ignored, and the power dynamics within the bank were being redrawn before everyone's eyes. By the end of this escalation, Central Trust Bank had transformed from a bastion of tradition into a battleground for justice. The confrontation had exposed deep-seated biases and ignited a movement that demanded transparency, accountability, and reform. The energy in the bank, the voices of the community, and the relentless push for truth all converged to set the stage for an inevitable turning point, a moment that promised to redefine the institution and restore faith in its commitment to fairness. The decisive moment came during a high-stakes board meeting held in the bank's grand conference room. The room was filled with senior board members, legal advisors, and representatives of the community, all gathered to hear the final outcome of the internal investigation. With an air of calm authority, Inspector David Ramirez took the podium and addressed the assembly. After a thorough review of all evidence, it is clear that Mr. Pierce's actions were not only unjustified, but were driven by deep-seated personal bias, he declared. His voice was firm and resolute, echoing off the polished walls. A heavy silence fell over the room as his words sank in. Effective immediately, Mr. Ronald Pierce is suspended from his duties pending a full disciplinary review, Inspector Ramirez continued. The announcement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Mr. Pierce, once so confident in his authority, now appeared small and defeated, his face a mask of shock and regret. At that moment, Mabel Johnson's attorney, a calm and determined woman named Tasha Reynolds, rose to speak. "This is not merely a case of one man's error," she said. "It is a clear example of how prejudice can infect even the most trusted institutions. Today, we stand not only for Mabel, but for every citizen who has suffered at the hands of unchecked bias." Her words struck a chord in the room, and the murmurs of approval grew louder. The turning point was sealed when Leonard Brooks, the dignified father of the young boy who had been at the center of the incident, stepped forward. His presence was commanding and unexpected. Clad in a sharp suit and carrying an air of quiet authority, Leonard addressed the assembly. "I have spent my life upholding the values of justice and fairness. Today, we have witnessed a profound betrayal of those values. No one is above accountability, and we will not tolerate discrimination in any form." His words resonated deeply with everyone present, and the atmosphere shifted from one of disbelief to determined resolve. Inspector Ramirez then presented a comprehensive dossier that included digital logs, security footage, and internal records, evidence that left no room for doubt. The dossier revealed that Mr. Pierce had a long history of similar misconduct, and the presentation was so compelling that even some of his staunchest supporters began to question his judgment. As the final piece of evidence was laid out, the gravity of the situation became undeniable. In that defining moment, the power dynamics in the room shifted irrevocably. The system that had once allowed Mr. Pierce to wield his authority unchecked was now forced to confront the truth. The verdict was clear. The bank would not stand for such acts of prejudice. The decision to suspend Mr. Pierce was not merely punitive. It was a powerful declaration that integrity and respect must prevail. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and relieved sighs. The turning point had arrived, and with it came a promise of reform. The shock on Mr. Pierce's face, captured by every camera in the room, was a silent testament to the fact that even those in positions of power could be held accountable. For Leonard Brooks, Tasha Reynolds, and every member of the community who had long fought for justice, this moment marked the beginning of a new era, a future in which fairness was no longer an aspiration but a reality. In the days that followed the explosive board meeting, Central Trust Bank underwent a transformation that resonated throughout the community. News of Mr. Pierce's suspension and the thorough investigation led by Inspector Ramirez spread rapidly, igniting conversations about accountability, transparency, and the need for systemic reform in financial institutions. Local media hailed the decision as a turning point, a clear stand against prejudice in a place that had long been seen as a pillar of community trust. Mabel Johnson, though shaken by the ordeal, continued to display the grace and dignity that had defined her life. With the support of her attorney, Tasha Reynolds, she became a vocal advocate for change. Public forums and community meetings were held where citizens expressed their solidarity and demanded that similar acts of discrimination never be tolerated again. Mabel's calm, unwavering resolve had become a symbol of the strength that lies within those who have faced injustice, and her story inspired many to speak out against racial bias. Leonard Brooks, the father of the young boy who had suffered in silence, also emerged as a prominent figure in the movement for reform. His dignified intervention and quiet leadership had not only exposed the prejudice of one man, but had also set a powerful example of accountability. In subsequent interviews, Leonard emphasized that true power comes from the ability to serve and protect all members of the community with fairness. His words were widely quoted in local newspapers and social media, further bolstering the public demand for change. Lieutenant Marcus Daniels, who had been a steady force throughout the investigation, wasted no time in implementing new policies within the bank. Over the following weeks, the bank introduced mandatory training programs on cultural sensitivity and ethical conduct. The Internal Review Committee, bolstered by the evidence from Inspector Ramirez's investigation, recommended sweeping reforms designed to ensure that no employee could ever again act on personal bias without consequence. Daniels made it clear that these changes were not just about punishing one individual, but about rebuilding trust with the community. Officer Ronald Pierce's case became a cautionary tale that was discussed in local forums and even in departmental meetings. His suspension and the detailed records of his past misconduct served as a stark reminder that no one, regardless of position, was exempt from accountability. Although his future remained uncertain, the incident had already sparked a broader cultural shift within the bank. The community responded with a renewed sense of unity. At a well-attended town hall meeting held at Central Trust Bank's headquarters, community members, bank officials, and local leaders gathered to discuss the path forward. In his address, Inspector Ramirez stated, "Today marks not just the end of one chapter, but the beginning of a new era for Central Trust Bank. We are committed to upholding the values of fairness, transparency, and respect for every member of our community." His words were met with enthusiastic applause and a promise from the crowd to remain vigilant in the pursuit of justice. As the meeting drew to a close, Leonard Brooks and Mabel Johnson stood together at the front of the room, symbols of resilience and hope. The painful lessons of that day had not only led to immediate reform, but had also set the stage for lasting change. Central Trust Bank was on a new path, one where every individual, regardless of background, will be treated with the dignity they deserved. In the final days following the incident, the bank's renewed commitment to accountability began to transform its reputation. Customers returned, confident that the institution they trusted was now governed by principles of fairness. The local media continued to cover the story, praising the swift action taken and the positive steps toward reform. In the end, The incident that began with a hateful act of aggression became a catalyst for a much-needed transformation. Central Trust Bank emerged as a beacon of hope and progress, a living example that even the most entrenched prejudices can be overcome when truth and accountability are given the space to flourish. For the community, for Mabel Johnson, and for every individual who had long fought against injustice, the promise of a fairer future shone brightly, reminding everyone that change is always possible.